Hello and welcome to this video on the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is one of the most important foreign policy statements in American history, and it has had a profound impact on the United States and the world. In this video, we'll explore the background and context of the Monroe Doctrine, its key provisions, and its legacy and impact on world events. President James Monroe Monroe was a veteran of the American Revolution and had served as governor of Virginia, a senator, and a secretary of state. He was deeply committed to American independence and the protection of American interests, and he was determined to establish the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was issued at a time of great international change and upheaval. The Industrial Revolution had dramatically increased Europe's economic and military power, and European powers were seeking to expand their empires. At the same time, many Latin American countries were struggling for independence from Spain and Portugal, and there was a fear that European powers would seek to intervene in the Americas to protect their interests. The background of the Monroe Doctrine also needs to be understood in the context of American politics and society at the time. The United States was a young and growing nation, and there was a growing sense of national pride and a desire to assert American influence in the world. At the same time, there was a strong isolationist sentiment in the United States, and many Americans were wary of getting involved in foreign affairs. Provision 1 of the Monroe Doctrine declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to further European colonization. This meant that any attempts by European powers to establish new colonies in the Americas would be seen as a hostile act and would be opposed by the United States. This provision was aimed at preventing European expansion in the Americas and safeguarding American interests. The provision reflected the growing sense of nationalism and independence that was sweeping the Western Hemisphere in the early 19th century. Latin American nations were struggling to assert their independence from Spain and Portugal, and many in the United States were wary of European intervention in the region. Provision 1 of the Monroe Doctrine was intended to ensure that the Americas would be free from European colonization and interference, and to help establish the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Despite the provisions of the Monroe Doctrine, European intervention in the Western Hemisphere continued, although on a smaller scale. The United States often used the doctrine as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American nations, and the provision helped to solidify American dominance in the region. Provision 2 of the Monroe Doctrine declared that the United States would consider any attempt by European powers to interfere with the affairs of the Western Hemisphere as a threat to its own security. This meant that the United States would view any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of Latin American nations as a hostile act and would respond accordingly. This provision was aimed at deterring European intervention in the Western Hemisphere and helping to protect the independence of Latin American nations. The provision reflected the growing sense of nationalism and independence that was sweeping the Western Hemisphere in the early 19th century. Latin American nations were struggling to assert their independence from Spain and Portugal, and many in the United States were wary of European intervention in the region. Provision 2 of the Monroe Doctrine was intended to help ensure that the Americas would be free from European interference, and to help establish the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Despite the provisions of the Monroe Doctrine, European intervention in the Western Hemisphere continued, although on a smaller scale. The United States often used the doctrine as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American nations, and the provision helped to solidify American dominance in the region. While not explicitly stated in the Monroe Doctrine, it was widely understood that the United States would take on a leadership role in the Western Hemisphere and would be responsible for maintaining stability and protecting American interests. This provision was aimed at establishing American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and ensuring that the United States would be the primary power in the region. The Monroe Doctrine had a significant impact on the development of Latin America. By declaring that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European colonization, the doctrine helped to prevent further European expansion in the region. This allowed Latin American nations to focus on their own development and independence, rather than worrying about interference from Europe. Additionally, the doctrine helped to protect the independence of Latin American nations, and the United States often used the doctrine as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American countries to protect American interests. The Monroe Doctrine also had a significant impact on international relations. By declaring that the United States would consider any European intervention in the Americas as a threat to its own security, the doctrine established the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. This helped to deter European intervention in the region, and European powers generally respected the Monroe Doctrine and stayed out of the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine continued to play an important role in world events during the Cold War. The United States often used the doctrine as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American countries to counter the spread of communism, and the doctrine helped to solidify American dominance in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War. The legacy of the Monroe Doctrine is a mixed one. On one hand, the doctrine helped to establish the United States as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere and played an important role in shaping the development of Latin America. On the other hand, the doctrine was often used by the United States as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American countries, which had a negative impact on the region. Despite these controversies, the Monroe Doctrine remains an important part of American history and continues to shape American foreign policy in the region. The Monroe Doctrine continues to be relevant to this day, and its provisions continue to shape American foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. The doctrine remains an important statement of American interests in the region, and the United States continues to use it as a justification for intervening in the affairs of Latin American countries to protect American interests. Additionally, the doctrine continues to serve as a symbol of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and continues to be seen as a warning to European powers to stay out of the Americas.